change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of John. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So Peter here, he's trying to kill this high priest, poor Arab slave. And the thought why it mentions the name of the slave, why it mentions Malchus, most people think that Malchus actually probably became a Christian and that he was known by the early church. Because a lot of times we'll read a name and they'll put a name in the gospel or they'll put a name in the book of Acts because that person was actually known by the people. And we see that if we read Luke 22:50, that Jesus immediately healed his ear. And it says that Jesus touched his right ear. So it's real possible one of the reasons Malchus did become a Christian is because this is the very last miracle that Jesus ever performed on earth, was the healing of this man's ear. And you think he might have healed it for Malchus' sake, and that's real possible. But he probably also healed Malchus' ear because he's still protecting Peter. Because if Malchus' ear was not healed, then Peter would not have been let go by the Roman army, because Peter would have been considered and treated like a Jewish zealot, which was the armed Jewish people that were fighting against Rome. And so Jesus tells Peter, he says, put away your sword. And he told him that Jesus needed to drink this cup that he had received from his Father. And the reason that Jesus could accept this cup from his Father is because this cup mixed by his Father was a measured cup, and it was mixed by his Father. And so Jesus, he knew he had nothing to fear. And that's the same for us. When the Father mixes us a cup to drink, we have nothing to fear. And even if that cup is a cup of sorrow or a cup of suffering, because the suffering will end, because those cups have been pre-measured also. In 1 Corinthians 10:13, we read, no temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. All right, that's talking about temptation, but it's the same principle. When something comes from the Father, we can bear it too. So we can bear the things that the Lord allows in our lives. All right. So now we read that the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him and led him to Annas first. Jesus allowed himself to be bound by the Romans. Who Jesus was really bound by, he was actually really bound by his Father. And it's just like the story 2,000 years before this with Isaac, where he was willingly bound by his father, Abraham, and he was bound the same way to be sacrificed. So here, Jesus willingly submitting to the Father to be bound, he allows himself to be bound by these Romans and taken away. And they took him to Annas first. Now, Annas here is not the official high priest. Annas had been the high priest, and they knew that according to the law, that the high priest, when he's anointed for life. But these were very, very confusing religious times in Israel. And because of the Roman rule And because of the temple being such big business, with so much money going through that even the Jews allowed Annas to be removed by the Romans. And they made his son-in-law Caiaphas the official high priest. And the only reason we know that Rome had removed Annas is just because they didn't like him, but they could get along with Caiaphas. And there was so much money that went through this temple. And these people, this family of priests, they ruled it as if it was their own personal family business. But the Jewish people, they still regarded Annas as their high priest. And so they brought him to Annas first. But we can look at Caiaphas and we remember, because we remember back in chapter 11 that God recognized Caiaphas as the high priest because he allowed him to prophesy that one man should die for the nation. So now we have Peter, and he's following Jesus. And Peter, he's still going and he's making one bad decision after another because he's not listening to Jesus. We see that he was sleeping when he should have been praying. And Jesus had just secured his release, and he told him what would happen this night. And now he's sitting there and he's following Jesus. And that's because Peter's being led by his pride. Peter's being led by his own self-will. And we're also told here that there was another disciple that was following Jesus, and we assume that disciple was John. And we're also told that disciple was known by the high priest. And what people think is they think that John was probably known by the high priest because of his father Zebedee's fishing business, because they were actually a wealthy fishing business. That's why they had servants and they were allowed to let John and James leave the family. And so they believe that they may have supplied the fish to the priests. So John, since he knew them, they let him in the courtyard, and then he goes out and he brings Peter in. And there was a slave girl that was at the door, and she said, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And that means that the girl knew that John was one of Jesus' disciples. And the way that this phrase is phrased in the original language, she's expecting to have a no answer. And another way that you could say this is like, you're not another one, are you? And she expected Peter to say no. And the amazing thing is that Peter did say no. But Peter, he didn't have to say anything. And so you're looking at this, and you imagine for a minute that you're Peter, and you think, well, what is he thinking? What's Peter thinking? Now, he couldn't deliver Jesus in the garden, and he's not going to be able to deliver Jesus here in the enemy's camp. And he's not even able to stand up to a little girl watching the door. And the truth is, Jesus doesn't want to be delivered, because this is Jesus' hour that he came into the world. And this is why he came for. But, if you think about it, maybe it was Peter didn't have anywhere else to go, because all the disciples, they're all scattered. There's no place to sleep for the night. The camp has been broken up. And he's like, well, what am I supposed to do? Am I just supposed to go back to Capernaum now and go back to my wife and start fishing again? And so he's got all these things going on, and now he's cold. And so he goes and sits down with the enemy. And this one, it says he stands, but in the other Gospels, it's real clear that he actually sat down with them. And he's sitting at this fire, and he's trying to blend in, and he's trying to warm himself. Now, Jesus knew that Peter would be there because he had already told him that he would. And so now, while he's sitting there warming himself, they start this unofficial, illegal, non-public, the impeachment trial of Jesus, and it's behind closed doors. We've never heard of anything like that before, but this was the first one I've ever heard of. And this is before Annas, the former high priest. Now, this is not any kind of official meeting. This is not a meeting of the Sanhedrin, but that will happen later, but not in John's gospel. And that happens with Caiaphas. And that trial is not even mentioned in John's gospel. So Annas, the acting high priest, he starts to ask Jesus questions. And what he asks is, he's asking, who are your disciples? And he wants their names. Because what he wants to do is he's going to get rid of his Jesus problem and his Jesus disciples problem. And then he asks him about his doctrines. And it's not that Annas wants to learn anything from Jesus. What he's really doing here is he's asking Jesus to tell on himself, because Annas needs something to accuse Jesus of. All Annas knows is that he wants to put Jesus to death, but he just doesn't know what crime to charge him with. So he's trying to get Jesus to tell on himself so that he can kill him. And Jesus answered Annas, and he says, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and the temple, where the Jews always meet. And in secret, I've said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I've said. Now, here looks like Jesus is defending himself, but he's not defending himself, and he's also not even trying to be released. But what Jesus is really basically saying is that he said nothing in secret, everything was public. And because the Jews' legal system was a lot like our legal system, the accused had rights. They had legal rights like we do. They have the right not to testify against themselves. And so Jesus, he had the right to say nothing. And if you look at it, Jesus had not even been charged with anything yet. And so what Jesus is saying, shouldn't this really be handled in the legal way? In the legal way, there would be charges, and then they would have witnesses. He wouldn't have to. Other people are supposed to find him guilty. He's not supposed to find himself guilty, and he actually had nothing to be guilty of. And there's another point here that, according to their laws that they have, and they're written in the Talmud, that nothing was ever supposed to happen at night. And all these legal protections of the accused, they were not afforded to Jesus. He was given none of them. And so Jesus is exposing this, that they are not even up to their own legal standards. And then all of a sudden, an officer comes and he strikes Jesus with the palm of his hand. And he said, you don't answer the high priest like that. But Jesus, he wasn't supposed to have to answer at all. And there's another thing you're not really ever supposed to do as an officer. You're never supposed to hit somebody in handcuffs, and mostly when they're not even charged with any kind of crime. And so Jesus, he didn't say anything wrong. This was just an act of pure brutality. And so Jesus asked him, and he says, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why did you strike me? And after Jesus said that, and he asked him that question, nobody answered him anything, because none of them had anything to say, because they knew that Jesus, he was speaking the truth. But this whole thing is never about truth. All this was about is, how do we kill Jesus, and how do we get away with it? And so now Annas sends Jesus, and he sends him bound to the official high priest, Caiaphas. And they're going to have the second official, and this will be the official one, illegal trial of Jesus. And they're going to get the approval that they need by this makeshift meeting of the Sanhedrin to illegally condemn Jesus to death. But before Jesus is led away, we still see Peter warming himself, and he's still sitting with the enemy. And he's not blending in very well. And according to Mark 14, they had picked up on his Galilean accent, and Peter ends up denying that. But then Marcus's cousin says, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" And more accurately, that would be read, "Did I not see you with my own eyes in the garden with him?" So Malchus's cousin seen Peter cutting off his cousin's ear. But Peter denied it. And it says that in Matthew, it says that Peter swears, "I don't know the man." And it doesn't mean that Peter was using swear words, but what he was doing is he was putting himself under an oath, or rather, he's putting himself under a curse, saying, if I'm not telling the truth, let me be anathema, or whatever that word is. Let me be damned. And the last thing here is we don't read it here, but in Luke 22:61, we're told that Jesus turned around and he looked at Peter. And so you think of Jesus turning around and looking at Peter. Jesus didn't turn around and look at Peter in disappointment. Jesus already knew that Peter would deny him. But what Jesus did is he turned around to look at Peter to reassure him. He was reassuring him that he would be restored, because Jesus, he cared much more about Peter at this time than he even cared about himself. And then we hear that Peter ran out and he wept bitterly. And we know that that's quite a different reaction than Judas's. Okay, and this is the application from this. The application is like when we fail, and we fail Jesus and we deny him in something in our lives, that he's also not disappointed in us. He's already seen it. He already knew. The thing is that we're disappointed in us because we didn't know that we could go that low or we could do those kind of things. But Jesus already knew, and he still had already chosen us, just like Peter, and that he's always ready, and he's always willing to restore us and to forgive us whenever we ask. All right, so it's early morning, and it's been a really, really long night. Jesus has been led now from Caiaphas's house to the Praetorium. Both of these places can be seen in Israel. They're both on the Via Dolorosa, which is Latin for the painful path or the road of suffering. Now, Caiaphas's house, it was buried under the street level, and at its very lowest level, you can find a dungeon there, and it has these metal rings that are actually embedded into the rock. And it was to bind prisoners for them to be beaten. And it's really possible that Jesus was actually beaten there. And we know from the other gospel accounts that before Jesus was brought to the Praetorium, that Jesus had been held at Caiaphas's that night. And he gathered whatever members he could get of the Sanhedrin for an illegal trial. And that's where the council found Jesus guilty of blasphemy, because Jesus had confessed plainly to them that he was the Christ, and they found him worthy of death. But the council, they had to wait until the morning to give their official verdict, because it's illegal to try a capital case, a death penalty case, at night. And so Jesus was condemned at the very earliest possible moment, the very first thing in the morning. And then now Jesus, he's being led away to a second trial. He's had no sleep. It's early morning. In fact, Jesus will never rest again while he's in this world. He'll have no rest till he returns to his Father in heaven. And so Jesus is going to face a second trial, and this one's not a religious trial. This one is a government trial. This is a Roman trial. And so Jesus is now at the Praetorium, which is the official residence of the military governor. And the military governor was Pontius Pilate. And that residence that Pontius Pilate lived at the Antonia Fortress. And you can see that fortress today. And you can go down in the digs and you see the actual pavement where they brought Jesus. And that's where they kept him. And on the ground there, you can see these games that are carved into the stone. When the soldiers were down there and watching prisoners, that they would play these board games that they had actually carved into the marble. And so as the chief priests and the elders, they bring Jesus there and they bring him to Pilate's residence. They refuse to go in. And we're told here, the reason they didn't go in, they didn't want to defile themselves because they wanted to eat the Passover meal. And you would think about it, that it would be funny that you can defile yourself by entering a Gentile's home, but you're not defiled by concocting a murderous plan against an innocent man who just happens to be the Christ. But what it is that in this Gentile's home, what there would be leaven, and leaven is yeast. And that's what we use to make our dough rise when we have nice, fluffy, tasty bread. But see, leaven is a symbol of sin because of its decaying effect. And that's what sin does to men. It decays us. And so all the leaven had to be removed from every Jew's house a week prior to the Passover. And his house, being a Gentile's residence, because he was a Roman, he was not a Jew, it would have leaven in it. And so Pilate, the governor, he accommodates these Jews and he goes out to them. Now the Jews, they hated Pilate. And Pilate, he hated the Jews. And even though he was appointed to be the governor of Judea, he still had a distaste for the Jews. And history makes Pilate out to be this very cruel, ruthless man. And he's known for being insensitive, and he's also known for being insulting. He was very weak, and he was very cowardly. But he covered up his weakness and his cowardliness by acts of violence. And history shows that his only interests were protecting himself and protecting his job. And the only reason that Pilate became the governor of Judea was because he had married the granddaughter of Caesar Augustus. And so Pilate was appointed to the position of the governor of Judea by Caesar Augustus's son, which was Caesar Tiberius. And so now Pilate goes out, and he goes out to these chief priests and the elders, and he says, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" Well, the Jews, they couldn't say blasphemy. They couldn't say blasphemy. Jesus called himself the Son of God, because blasphemy was not a crime in Rome. Even calling yourself a god or a son of God was not a Roman crime. That they were pagans. And the truth is that the Jewish leaders, they didn't want Pilate to judge Jesus at all. All they wanted from Pilate was for Pilate to kill him on their word. So they tell Pilate, they say, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." So they're basically saying, "We've already condemned him. We just want you to kill him."
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,